In 1940, France found itself at a critical juncture, outwardly poised and ready to fend off German aggression, yet internally hampered by uncertainty, disarray, and a rising sense of strategic misdirection. This video delves into the months preceding France's downfall in World War II, starting with the so-called Phony War that began after France declared war in September 1939. In this period of unsettling tranquility, French leaders geared up for a protracted conflict they believed they could win, while harboring quiet fears that Germany might strike before they were adequately prepared. You'll discover how French policymakers deliberated over war objectives, how both soldiers and civilians braved the bitter winter of 1939 to 1940, and why the German invasion in May 1940 abruptly dashed their expectations. From industrial mobilization and frontline morale to propaganda shortcomings, political discord, and the sweeping German offensive that ensued, we'll explore how France, despite possessing one of Europe's largest armies, succumbed in a mere 6 weeks. This narrative isn't solely about military defeat. It's also a tale of how a democracy reacts to the pressures of war, the implications of time becoming an adversary, and how a nation's assurance can disintegrate even before the first shots ring out. France entered the Second World War with uncertain hopes. Initially, policymakers believed the conflict would stretch for years, as it would take time for the Allies to assemble the resources needed to defeat Germany. Conversely, there was a common belief that Germany's resource shortages would compel it to strike sooner. During the Phony War, spanning from September 1939 to May 1940, some policymakers started to fret that time might not favor the Allies after all. Less clear was the general public's perception of how long the war would rattle on. It became a lull, a quirky war with no fighting. Commentators and historians alike have debated the extent to which the inactivity on the Western Front influenced France's military performance once the German assault commenced on May 10, 1940. Despite significant increases in armament production, French military leaders recognized their forces were lacking in anti-tank weapons, communication tools, anti-aircraft artillery, and aircraft. The millions of men mobilized at the conflict's onset fulfilled their responsibilities with discipline. After Poland fell and the bitter winter of 1939 to 1940 began, morale dipped. Yet, as spring arrived, it revitalized the front and coincided with Hitler's offensive in Scandinavia. Germany invaded Poland on September 1st. If France honored its commitment to Poland and declared war on Germany, could it be certain of victory? Peter Jackson suggests that Daladier and his cabinet viewed the situation with confidence. In contrast, Talbot Imlay argues they weren't truly optimistic about the balance of power. They felt compelled to declare war because of France's moral duty to Poland and the fear that delaying would put the democracies in an even tougher strategic position. Consequently, Britain and France declared war on Germany on September 3rd. The Vichy regime and its supporters claimed that Britain dragged France into the war, that Daladier acted unconstitutionally by misleading the National Assembly into believing it would have a vote prior to the declaration of war, and that the French people were forced into conflict against their will. Yet, numerous accounts indicate things were not so simple. The National Assembly understood Daladier's proposal to increase war funding, despite his frequent references to peace over war in his speech. Jean-Louis Crémieux-Briac highlights the conflicting recollections within the National Assembly. Did Prime Minister Édouard Daladier promise parliamentarians a specific vote on declaring war? Ultimately, Daladier didn't want to risk a divisive debate, diverging from the precedents of 1870 and 1914. The war commenced, shrouded in uncertainty. Former Prime Minister and pacifist Pierre Laval later claimed that if the National Assembly had been allowed to vote on the war, he would have warned his colleagues that France would be fighting alone, in a war it could not win. French military planners believed that without Soviet support, Poland could only resist a German attack for a few months, perhaps until the following spring. In reality, Polish resistance lasted less than 4 weeks. By the end of September, Poland was completely under German and Soviet control. Years later, the writer Jacques Benoit Méchain, who would later support Franco-German collaboration, recalled a lunch in August 1939 with General Maurice Gamelin, the commander-in-chief of the French armed forces. During this lunch, Gamelin confidently assured Benoît Michon that once war broke out, there would be widespread discontent in Germany, the army would remove Hitler from power, and French troops would easily move into Germany. However, contrary to this prediction, Hitler exploited his swift victory over Poland, extending peace offers to the Allies in September and early October. These offers were turned down first by Daladier and then by Chamberlain, and so the war dragged on. For the time being, the Western Front remained quiet. While publicly calling for peace, Hitler secretly ordered plans for a Western attack known as Fall Gelb, but these plans faced delays, primarily due to poor weather. Fabrice Grenard rightly points out that the so-called drôle de guerre was anything but amusing. It was a harsh ordeal for many in France. Families faced separation due to mobilization, fears of sudden airstrikes loomed large, and populations in border areas had to abandon their homes, leaving everything behind for an uncertain future. The sacrifices made on the home front for the war effort were taxing. The winter of 1939 to 1940 was especially brutal, with a troubling increase in deaths among mobilized troops, many of whom weren't physically prepared for such challenges. The civilian population also suffered a similar rise in death rates, compounded by food shortages. Discussions during this phony war sparked debates about the French people's willingness to fight. Reports from military mobilization and the public sentiment in September 1939 indicated that while most people were resigned to war, they were resolved to fulfill France's commitments and put an end to German aggression for good. Grenard's examination of diaries, letters, and reports from the time reveals that the mobilization order was widely followed and executed smoothly, affecting over 4.5 million men, almost a quarter of the male population of France. There were very few refusals or desertions. Soldiers were high in spirits, while the civilian population remained stoic, reflective, calm, and determined. There was little uncertainty about the underlying cause of the war. It was time to confront Hitler once and for all. Enough was enough. The sentiment was clear. It was essential to bring the situation to an end. There were no public demonstrations from pacifists, unlike during the Munich crisis. Within the political sphere, vocal pacifists dwindled to just a few, primarily from the socialists and the far left, along with some fascistic groups and supporters of Nazi Germany. Grenard notes that while a significant majority of the French people seemed confident in victory, these supporters of Germany were the only ones who believed that France had everything to lose in a war against such powerful German forces. To them, defeat appeared inevitable. The lack of fighting on the Western Front came with its own set of advantages and disadvantages. On one side, the Allies had more time to prepare militarily and bolster their supplies. On the other hand, the risk that this inactivity could severely dampen the morale of their troops was ever present. Various other factors quickly began to affect morale. The massive call-up in early September 1939 drained industry and agriculture of many of their crucial workers. Essential personnel in the armaments sector who had gone to the front needed to be recalled. Otherwise, the factories would grind to a halt. This decision led to tensions between the newly appointed Minister of Armaments, Raoul Dautry, and the military leaders. Ultimately, the urgency of the situation required that 500,000 soldiers be returned to their jobs between September and April. Those in these special assignments, known as affectés spéciaux, ultimately numbered 1,200,000. The working week was lengthened further, with some workers laboring 60 hours a week, and those in the armaments sector facing 72-hour weeks. Collective bargaining rights were suspended, and strikes were banned. Pay rates were frozen by law, and overtime rates matched basic pay, with a 40% levy applied to overtime. At the same time, inflation started to take hold quickly. Workers grew increasingly dissatisfied with their economic situation, and there are indications of slowdowns and non-cooperative behavior in various factories. Some communist workers were encouraged to adhere to their party's belief that the war served imperialist interests, and they were advised not to help with labor. Critics labeled this viewpoint as revolutionary defeatism. Authorities became extremely worried that communist workers might attempt to disrupt production, a concern that would resonate after their defeat. While journalist Angelo Tosca claimed there was evidence of sabotage in many important factories, historians today think that such cases were actually uncommon. The same applies to sabotage from German fifth columnists. During the Phony War, there were no industrial strikes. Planning for armaments production proved to be a significant challenge. After the Popular Front government nationalized aircraft manufacturing companies in 1936 and 1937, Daladier's administration adopted a mostly hands-off approach to the economy from 1938 onward. However, this approach needed to change during wartime, as Dautry had to work with uncooperative employers to upgrade the industry with new machinery. He faced tremendous obstacles. Material shortages, a lack of components, and insufficient labor resulted from poor planning and a poorly executed mobilization. Still, Crémieux-Brillac noted that by the end of the Phony War, the factory front was functioning well following a shaky start. The re-equipping of the industry was aligned with a plan covering 4 to 5 years, which was the anticipated duration of the war by the French High Command. By May 1940, the assembly lines were producing 250 tanks and were on pace to surpass Germany's production rates by summer. A revitalized aircraft industry was swiftly growing, with 250,000 workers on the job. Overall, armaments production was advancing. Talbot Imlay offers a more critical view, emphasizing the conflict between industry groups and trade unions. The unions called for greater state involvement in economic policy, but after the defeat of the general strike in 1938, industrial employers felt empowered and convinced the government to stick with laissez-faire policies, an approach that proved unsuitable in wartime. The ensuing chaos, highlighted by disappointing production numbers, evident inequalities, and fears of the subversive intentions of French workers, created an atmosphere of economic despair among French leaders, draining their confidence in a prolonged war strategy that relied on the belief that time would work in their favor. Despite Dautry's earnest attempts and the agreements made at the Hotel Majestic, where industry and labor committed to collaborating for the greater good, production suffered from poor workforce planning, a shortage of skilled labor, and overall disorganization within the economy. Actual output fell short of the anticipated figures for fighter planes, bombers, various types of tanks, artillery, anti-tank and anti-aircraft weapons, and ammunition. Even prior to the conflict, the government had to turn to foreign countries for aircraft to compensate for domestic production losses. Now, there was an urgent need to place orders in America for machine tools as well. Purchasing internationally was costly, draining valuable foreign currency reserves. Finance Minister Paul Reynaud was acutely aware of the country's limited financial resources. His efforts to conserve the nation's assets by cutting non-military expenditures, raising taxes, and limiting consumption were hindered by Daladier, who was concerned about the economic strain already felt by the French populace. In a radio address on September 10, 1939, Reynaud proclaimed, "We will win because we are the strongest," a statement that would later return to haunt him. As Grenard pointed out, for some, that slogan became emblematic of the short-sightedness and incompetence of the French leadership at the war's outset. Furthermore, the unfolding events of the war prompted uncertainty. France had entered the conflict to defend Poland, yet Poland no longer existed. There were whispers among some in France and Britain questioning the rationale behind the war. Soldiers at the front were bombarded with messages from the enemy's loudspeakers and leaflets dropped by German aircraft flying overhead. While communists blamed international bankers and industrialists for the war, German propaganda pointed fingers at the British. Radio Stuttgart told its French audience that the British had tricked France into the war, which the British would pursue to the last French soldier. You are compelled to support a nation you despise in order to fight against one that extends its hand in friendship. It's unclear how much this propaganda influenced the soldiers. However, it's evident that French propaganda was largely ineffective. According to François Cochet, the French Information Commissariat led by Jean Giraudoux failed to clarify the strategy for fighting the war, and did not inspire the nation. This lack of communication is, without a doubt, a significant defeat for French democracy during the strange war period. Many shared this view, both before and after the defeat. The Allies anticipated a prolonged conflict, but Renaud increasingly worried that time was not in France's favor. He addressed the Chamber of Deputies on December 13th, stating that the French people needed to make economic sacrifices to secure victory. France could not triumph in a long war without adjusting its economic policies. We will win, but to overcome the enemy, we must first master ourselves. He expressed doubt about the effectiveness of the economic blockade against Germany. On December 28, 1939, he told the Senate, "It's not just about sustaining the war, but about winning it. For those who believe time favors us, I counter that time is neutral. It will pass quickly if we allow it to. Certainly, we have greater war potential. But what the democracies have lacked for 20 years to achieve peace is not superior resources, but clarity and courage. Now we are at war. Will our resolve be stronger than the enemy's? Will our people's unity be more complete? If the answer is yes, then regardless of how the war unfolds, we will prevail." Renaud's calls for economic sacrifices did not reflect a lack of empathy for the struggles faced by ordinary French citizens. Living conditions were becoming more challenging. The brutal winter of 1939 and 1940 intensified the fuel shortages for heating. The absence of fathers, sons, and husbands at the front placed added burdens on women and the elderly. The rise of xenophobia and fears of a fifth column made life increasingly difficult for foreigners, including refugees, leading to many being detained in camps for long periods. Social and political tensions rose further with the ban on the Communist Party and its affiliated groups in September 1939. The turning point came with the Nazi-Soviet pact the month before. Members, supporters, and sympathizers faced harassment and, in some cases, prosecution and imprisonment. The party went underground while many leaders fled the country. Yet, through small groups of remaining members, their influence persisted in key areas, like Nord-Pas-de-Calais. They managed to produce and share underground literature, including the banned newspaper Humanité, which re-emerged about once a month during the Phony War, beginning in October 1939. The stark message aimed at French soldiers was clear. You think you are dying for the homeland. You are dying for bankers and industrialists. It's hard to gauge how much this propaganda swayed the general public, but authorities recognized the widespread dissatisfaction stemming from the tough living conditions during the war. Public sentiment fluctuated with the seasons, dipping in winter and reviving in spring, as many diaries and letters reveal. Soldiers at the front experienced similar mood swings, as thoroughly detailed by Cochet. Although the mobilization at the onset of the Phony War was initially smooth, several practical issues arose: insufficient uniforms, misassigned postings, and lack of comfortable living conditions. The absence of combat soon led to boredom among the troops. Days were filled with seemingly pointless activities. One soldier, Harmond, shared his daily routines. We played a lot of cards, teams formed, and we lost count of how many belote matches we had. We read anything we could find, from cheap novels to classic literature. Others sang or hummed popular tunes, with one member possessing an impressive operatic voice. I had brought an old phonograph from home. It worked well enough, along with a variety of records that pleased the music enthusiasts. Vincent the Southerner taught us how to create small macrame rugs, weaving threads into frames to create beautiful designs like roses and arabesques. The results were quite striking. As for me, I picked up drawing again, using charcoal and Indian ink. All these artworks were sent to Paris for an exhibition of military art, organized to benefit the military clubs. The exhibition enjoyed a degree of success. General Alan Brooke, the commander of the 2nd Corps of the British Expeditionary Force, famously remarked on the French army at the end of September 1939, noting their slovenliness and inefficiency, yet acknowledged their kindness. By early November, he pondered whether the French were still a strong enough nation to see the war through. The designation of les affectés spéciaux, which became public in October, sparked resentment among the soldiers still at the front. Pay also became a point of contention, as it was only a fraction of what British soldiers received. Eventually, leave from the front lines was allowed, but some soldiers returning home or visiting Paris felt frustrated by what they saw as life going on as usual. Others came back to find their farms in disrepair or their businesses struggling. The harsh winter of 1939 to 1940 led to a sense of despondency among the troops, with rising incidents of alcoholism and misconduct. Military discipline weakened, and cases of insubordination went unchecked. Even while opinions fluctuated and some questioned the war's purpose, there was no clear evidence of growing defeatism. By spring 1940, troop morale began to rebound. A small peace faction in the National Assembly, led by Laval, sought to end the war quickly, blaming the bellicists for the conflict rather than Hitler, who had not declared war on Britain and France. It was the Allies who had declared war on Germany, insisting that Hitler had no quarrel with them. However, this peace faction remained a minority. By the time the war began, as Pierre-Frédéric Charpentier suggests, pacifism in France had almost lost its influence. Disagreements among its leaders and government suppression of the press rendered integral pacifism ineffective in swaying public opinion. The revolutionary defeatism of the communists posed a more significant threat, but was stifled by government repression of the party. A third group of potentially seditious opponents consisted of various Germanophile or anti-Semitic writers and journalists, like George Hamel, Jean Boissel, Pierre Clémenty, Alphonse de Chateaubriand, Pierre Drieux-La Rochelle, and Louis Rebatté, who wished for a German victory. Some were imprisoned for colluding with the enemy. The pro-Hitler newspaper Je suis partout maintained an ostensibly neutral stance. However, its favorable portrayal of German social policies, coupled with its anti-communism and Anglophobia, suggested deeper sentiments that could be deciphered between the lines. Not all doubters of victory were extreme pacifists or German sympathizers. Renault's military liaison officer, Colonel Paul de Villaloum, publicly expressed skepticism about the Allies' ability to withstand Germany. Additionally, Alexis Léger, head of the Foreign Ministry, conveyed to President Roosevelt's envoy, Sumner Welles, in March 1940, that he was uncertain of the situation. However, his biographer, Renaud Meltz, implies he sought to rally American support for intervention in the European conflict as soon as possible. During the Polish campaign in September 1939, French forces briefly entered German territory in the Saar region before withdrawing, without any significant fighting. The question remained, how could the Allies win the war? They were haunted by the massive casualties of World War I and were intent on avoiding further bloodshed. Their hope rested on blockading the enemy, anticipating that economic turmoil would trigger the collapse of the Nazi regime. Some accepted the prospect of a prolonged war, some foresaw a conflict lasting 7 years, others suggested 100 years, and some envisioned a new kind of warfare where lives would be spared. They believed that economics, rather than bullets, would determine the outcome. In November, Daniel Barlone, a captain in the 2nd North African Division, pondered whether there would be any actual fighting. He questioned, are we truly going to have a war, or will we stand opposed for years? Most political and military leaders in France and Britain concurred that it would take several years to overcome Germany, as the Allies needed time to bolster their military strength before launching an invasion. They aimed to shield themselves from enemies while, behind that defense, worked to bolster their military capabilities to surpass Germany's armament levels. Research by François Bédarida on the Supreme War Council during the Phony War reveals that while there was consensus on the long-term strategy, the Allies were divided on how to intensify the blockade and engage the enemy in the short run. The British suggested bombing the Ruhr and mining the Rhine, but the French opposed this. Instead, the French wanted to target Romanian oil fields to cut off Germany's fuel supply and favored attacks in areas like Greece, the Caucasus, or Finland, which risked drawing the Soviets into the conflict, a prospect the British deemed too dangerous. In late November 1939, the Soviets invaded Finland after insisting on certain territorial concessions. This local skirmish complicated the larger struggle between Germany and the Allies. Driven by intense anti-communism, some French politicians, seemingly neglecting the fact that the Allies were at war with Germany, called for conflict with the Soviet Union, much to the dismay of the British. Right-wing Deputy Henri de Carillis cynically pointed out that those who previously wouldn't fight for Danzig were now eager to fight for Helsinki. While many Allied leaders pursued a strategy of a prolonged conflict with Germany, there were dissenting voices. In January 1940, Renault and Colonel Charles de Gaulle, a tank commander, advocated for proactive strikes against the Siegfried Line. However, General Bourret and his chief of staff, General Jean de Lattre de Tassigny, warned that any offensive action that year would likely lead to the destruction of the French army, and that minister and general who initiated such orders would face dire consequences. De Gaulle's perspective was evident in a letter he wrote to Renault in October 1939, which Julian Jackson describes as prophetic. The war was severely draining France's economic resources, costing the country 700 million francs each day. By the end of February 1940, Renault reiterated his earlier warnings from December. He publicly disclosed that France was in a strong financial position. After months of deliberation on how to limit the supply of Swedish iron ore to Germany, the Allies finally resolved in February to aid Finland, which had been under attack by the Soviet Union since late November, as a method to control the flow of resources. Unfortunately, by that point, it was too late. The Finns capitulated on March 12th, revealing the Allies' procrastination. Both supporters and opponents were displeased. Support for Daladier in Parliament waned, leading to his resignation as Prime Minister on March 19th. Renault, who succeeded him, took office with just a single vote majority in a divided chamber. Undeterred, he called for more decisive action from the Allies and signed an agreement with Britain, pledging that neither nation would pursue a separate peace with the enemy. There still appeared to be chances to counter German influence in Scandinavia. Swedish ore was transported by sea through the Gulf of Bothnia when it wasn't frozen, or through the North Sea along Norwegian coastal routes. The conclusion of the Soviet-Finnish conflict eliminated a reason to intervene and disrupt the first route. The Allies then planned to mine Norwegian waters to impede supply lines despite Norway's neutrality. However, the Allies were caught off guard. On April 9th, the Germans launched an offensive against Denmark and Norway. Just 5 days earlier, on April 4th, Chamberlain had told a Conservative Party gathering that Hitler had missed the bus by not attacking sooner. On April 13th, Renault announced over the radio that Allied troops in Norway had severed the enemy's permanent iron route. The bold statements from Chamberlain and Renault would come back to haunt them, revealing the unfortunate consequences of the Allies' stagnation and indecision. Renault, frustrated by the lack of military initiative, partly directed his annoyance at what he perceived as Gamelin's poor performance as commander-in-chief. To push for Gamelin's removal, Renault considered resigning and orchestrating Daladier's departure. This plan was abandoned when news broke of the German assault on the Low Countries on the 10th of May. For now, Gamelin would remain in his position. Years later, Léon Blum would speculate that France should have intervened forcefully to prevent Hitler and his party from rising to power in 1933. But by then, it was too late, and the reality of conflict had to be confronted. What was France's military readiness like just before the Battle of France? A lot of the ground lost to Germany while rearming had been regained. On the Western Front, the forces appeared evenly matched, and in some ways, slightly favored the Allies. While the Germans had 114 divisions, the Allies boasted 94 French divisions, 10 British, 22 Belgian, and 9 Dutch. Among these, the Germans fielded 10 armored divisions, and the French had 3. The Allies possessed 3,000 tanks compared to the Germans' 2,800. However, the Allies were lacking in aircraft, with 1,435 compared to 2,938 for the Germans. These figures were put together by Henry Michel in 1980. More recently, Jean-Luc Leleux compared the 3 million German troops on the Western Front to the Allies' total of 3.6 million, with 2.24 million being French. He noted that while the Germans had 2,445 tanks and artillery, the Allies had 3,874. He also highlighted that, although the Allies claimed more aircraft, they only had 1,453 operational bombers and fighters, against the Germans' 2,589. On a brighter note, the Allies had a significant edge in artillery, with 13,974 pieces versus the Germans' 7,378. How these forces were organized raised concerns. Since the war began, critics pointed out that the Allies squandered the opportunity for preparation during the Phony War for the upcoming battles on the Western Front. Nevertheless, some adjustments were made. The French High Command under Gamelin, with the backing of Britain's military and political leaders, revised the Dial Plan. This strategy called for Allied troops to advance into Belgium as soon as Germany attacked. Gamelin pushed for modifications to extend the Allied movement into Holland, reaching as far as Breda to connect with Dutch forces. Meanwhile, a significant advancement was the establishment of mobile armored units. They successfully formed 3 armored divisions and began the process for a 4th. But were those efforts sufficient? Maurice Vaillis contends that France wasted valuable time by not uniting their tank units into a coherent, concentrated, and mobile force capable of launching counterattacks. For Lieutenant Colonel Henry Duthaley, the establishment of motorized and armored units posed a challenge, as crucial components were missing. They severely lacked the necessary radio communication and logistical support for a mobile warfare strategy. The Phony War was filled with speculation about whether Hitler would launch an attack in the West, and if so, when that might happen. Some thought he would focus his efforts eastward, while others felt or hoped he wouldn't dare confront the Allies. A common belief was that if he did attack, France had adequate defenses. As Robert Young observed, the whole idea of a prolonged conflict relied on one key factor: preventing the Germans from achieving a swift and easy victory. Prior to September 1939, there were no intelligence reports indicating a forthcoming German assault on France, but the threat couldn't be ignored. Even General Gamelin, known for his complacency, did not rule out the chance of a sudden German offensive. Yet, did a surprise attack imply inevitable defeat? This was not the prevailing sentiment. It was widely accepted that the French army was the world's strongest and that France was well equipped for defense. Churchill would later note that this defensive stance was not questioned at the time. In those early months of the Second World War, I shared the general consensus regarding defense, convinced that properly positioned anti-tank barriers and field guns, armed with the right ammunition, could disrupt or halt tanks, except in darkness or fog, whether real or artificial. Should the Germans violate Belgium's neutrality, Alan Brooke suggested advancing to the Louvain-Wavre line with the French on one side and Belgians on the other. If we could get organized in time to face the German advance, it would be the most strategic move. This route through Belgium was the shortest possible, preserving half the country, while allowing time for coordinated efforts among the 3 nations, provided the Belgian forward units at the Albert Canal, Liège, and in the Ardennes could hold out long enough. However, we must firmly resist the temptation to defend the entire Albert Canal and Liège to save all of Belgium. Attempting to protect the whole region instead of just half would likely mean losing all of Belgium, and perhaps the war too. Such sentiments were common as the battle approached, and confidence was relatively high. Most people were unaware of the conflicts among Renault, Daladier, and Gamelin, as well as the rigid mindset of the High Command. They held on to their belief in the French army. The heated discussions regarding France's birth rate, immigrants, cultural identity, economic performance, party politics, ideologies, and foreign and defense policies faded away, stifled by harsh censorship. These issues might have become mere background noise, overshadowed by the chaos of battle. Pierre Laborie suggests that despite prior social divisions and ideological confusion, it would be mistaken to think the French were not prepared to fight. However, they needed to comprehend what they were fighting for. According to Laborie, the unclear purpose of the war and the inactivity during the Phony War led to confusion that drained their energy and willpower. While he doesn't claim defeat was unavoidable, he asserts that the lingering impact of the Phony War rekindled past divisions and irrationalities, reflections of the declining nation noted by philosopher Raymond Aron. But Labori doesn't establish how the country's divisions and confusions manifested in the chaos of the battlefield. How did the French people and others perceive and interpret the fall of France in 1940? To everyone's astonishment, French forces surrendered after just 38 days of fighting. Within 2 months of the German attack that began on May 10th, the Third Republic collapsed. Paris fell under occupation on June 14th. The armistices with Germany and Italy took effect on June 25th, and on July 10th, the National Assembly in Vichy voted to grant plenary powers to Marshal Pétain, effectively suspending the Republic's constitution. However, the rapid collapse contrasted sharply with the slow understanding ordinary people had of what was unfolding during those 6 weeks. Soldiers on the front lines and civilians fleeing from the enemy were the first to witness the swift advance of German forces into French territory. Meanwhile, most people in France only gradually became aware of the growing disaster. Few were aware of the intricate dealings taking place within the high command and the government, and the disputes among the Allies. Initially, both the government and high command struggled to grasp the scale of the situation on the battlefield. Moreover, the authorities imposed a near-total news blackout. Official statements were bland and empty. When German forces made a pivotal crossing over the Meuse River near Sedan on May 16th, the authorities described the clash between Namur and Sedan as having the character of a war of movement. Subsequently, the media tried to downplay the severity of the rapid German advance. Eventually, a combination of rumors, public announcements, and first-hand accounts from fleeing refugees and retreating soldiers revealed the unfolding disaster. Yet when Marshal Philippe Pétain announced on the radio on June 17th that he had requested an armistice, the news caught many by surprise, depending on their location and access to information. This discrepancy in understanding the course of battle is reflected in numerous eyewitness accounts from that time. The disorienting and staggering pace of events made it feel as though those experiencing it were in a different dimension of time. For civil servant Jean Chauvel, his monotonous routine stretched the days endlessly, yet events unfolded faster than the days themselves, alternating between anxiety and brief calm. In May, the newly appointed British Minister of Information, Alfred Duff Cooper, humorously stated that the public was too apt to exaggerate the importance of events. However, for most, the reality was undeniable once they became aware. Frank Pitcairn, writing in the Communist Daily Worker, remarked that the march of history had turned into a sprint. Changes that people would have believed would take years to unfold were happening in just weeks, days, or even hours. In a fistful of days, you've lived through volumes of history, declared the Daily Herald. To Ronald Walker, the News Chronicle correspondent with the Royal Air Force in France, 5 weeks felt like 5 years. At Blois Castle, the site of the Duke of Guise's assassination in 1588, a woman refugee looked over the ramparts and gazed at the streets below, proclaiming to the Daily Herald's war correspondent, "This is real history." Alfred Faber-Luce, a journalist and writer, was overwhelmed by experiences for 6 weeks to the point that his memory struggled to keep up. The time that had been set aside during the Phony War was now consumed in May. Historians usually describe the Battle of France in 2 parts: the Battle of the North, or the Battle of Flanders, which began with the initial attack on May 10th and concluded with the evacuation of Allied troops from Dunkirk on June 4th. The second part kicked off with the German assault on the Somme and Aisne rivers on June 5th and continued until the armistice on June 25th. The Germans referred to the first part as Case Yellow and the second as Case Red. General Erich von Manstein devised the attack plan with the backing of General Heinz Guderian, a recognized expert in armored warfare. German forces were split into 3 groups. Army Group B, led by General Fedor von Bock, comprising 29 divisions, including 3 panzer divisions, targeted Belgium and the Netherlands. Army Group A, under General Gerd von Rundstedt, included 45 divisions, 7 of which were panzer divisions, and aimed for France via Luxembourg and the Ardennes Forest. Army Group C, commanded by General Wilhelm von Lieb, was stationed further south and wasn't part of the initial offensive. When the German invasion began on May 10, 1940, it seemed the main assault was aimed at Belgium and the southern Netherlands, as the Allies anticipated. In response to urgent pleas for help from the Belgian and Dutch governments, the Allies activated their Dial and Breda plans, deploying the French 1st and 7th Armies and 8 divisions of the British Expeditionary Force north into Belgium and Holland, reaching Breda, Tilburg, and the Dial River. The 1st and 7th Armies included most of the French armored and motorized infantry divisions. The Allies' northern advance has been likened to a door swinging on its hinges. It took a week for them to grasp the true direction of the enemy's assault, though some participants had a clearer insight earlier on. On May 12th, Colonel Paul de Villaume, the chief military advisor to French Prime Minister Paul Reynaud, shared his concerns with Allied Commander General Maurice Gamelin. He warned that by advancing into Belgium, the Allies risked falling into a trap. Gamelin, still believing the main German offensive was aimed at Belgium, insisted they had to take the chance. In reality, the Germans focused their main attack on the Ardennes forest. Between May 12th and 14th, their forces, including tanks and mechanized infantry backed by Stuka bombers, launched an assault on the Meuse River and crossed it at 3 points, including Sedan. Facing them were the 2nd and 9th French armies, led by generals André Corap and Charles Hunziger. These armies consisted mainly of under-equipped and largely untrained reservists, who were unable to stop the German advancements. The French did deploy 3 armored divisions to mount counterattacks towards Sedan on May 14th and 15th, but the operation was delayed and Allied air support was minimal. The counterattacks were called off. German panzers, followed by motorized infantry, raced toward the Channel coast. Meanwhile, the Dutch army had surrendered. On May 16th, Reynaud informed British Prime Minister Winston Churchill in Paris that the battle was lost and Paris was at risk. The Germans covered over 300 kilometers and reached the Channel at Abbeville by May 20th, beginning a maneuver known as Sickelschitt, or Cut of the Sickle. By this time, the French 9th Army and the northern flank of the 2nd Army were devastated. The French 1st Army Group, the British Expeditionary Force, and the Belgian Army found themselves isolated from the main French forces in the south. Even though Villaume had a defeatist outlook, he was correct in this instance. The German attack on Belgium had indeed been a trap. Initially, the public was largely unaware of the German breakthrough, as official communications provided little insight into the battlefield developments during the first week of fighting, and no authorized reporters were allowed at the front. Instead of delivering hard news, French newspapers filled their pages with curses aimed at the enemy, labeling them as the barbaric Hun, a reference to the invasion of 1914, while extolling the bravery of the French soldier and the resilience of the French nation. They quickly condemned communists, suspected German spies, and imagined German parachutists disguised among them. On May 16th, Reynaud addressed the nation on radio, urging calm, refuting rumors about the government fleeing Paris, and asserting that French troops were encircling the enemy to the south of the Meuse. The following evening, national radio reported that Brussels had fallen to the enemy. It wasn't until May 18th that the press could announce that a major battle was underway at Maubeuge, east of Sedan. The severity of the military situation became increasingly apparent when Gamelin's grim directive, "Conquer or die," appeared in the newspapers that same day. Authorities intercepted calls revealing that public morale was beginning to falter. On that evening, Reynaud spoke on the radio, using euphemisms to describe the German advance moving west from Sedan. By this point, the military situation was so critical that Gamelin urged Reynaud to contemplate an armistice. Instead, Reynaud appointed Marshal Pétain as vice premier on May 18th to help bolster public morale. He also took over the defense ministry from Daladier, who was reassigned to foreign affairs, and named Georges Mandel, a key figure from the previous war, as the new interior minister. The next day, he replaced Gamelin with General Maxime Weygand, who had served as Marshal Foch's chief of staff. Meanwhile, Belgian refugees flooded into France, a tangible sign of the enemy's advance and the Allies' retreat. British war correspondent James Lansdale Hodson remarked in his diary on May 18th about the plight of refugees in Amiens. Some had entered a restaurant where we had shared our final meal, as it was to close for good that night. These refugees were desperate, barely able to secure a scrap of bread. We attempted to gather support for them to no avail, and ended up sharing meat tablets we had brought as emergency supplies, which offered little consolation to those in need. One simple explanation for the enemy's swift advance was the rumored presence of a fifth column. Captain Daniel Barlone, serving in the 2nd North African Division of the French First Army moving into Belgium, noted in his diary on May 11th that treachery and the fifth column are the main topics among the Belgian refugees. He admitted that while they listened, they remained quite skeptical and somewhat amused. Yet, less than 10 days later, he revised his view. The fifth column truly exists. Every night, blue, green, and red lights surface everywhere. A regiment can't stay in one spot for more than 2 hours without being bombarded by massive bombs, sending smoke soaring up to 300 feet high. Once the regiment moves, the bombing stops. Many, like Lansdale Hodson, questioned whether some of the refugees could be labeled as friends. The fight for France was being hampered by these refugees. They sought food and shelter, a restoration of spirit. France's resolve was facing a significant trial. Jean-Louis Crémieux-Briac referred to the psychosis of the fifth column, which manifested in the form of wild, unfounded rumors, fears of secret landings by parachutists, exaggerated tales of spies everywhere, and foreign nationals nearly being lynched. Weygand himself bought into the idea of the fifth column, telling Reynaud that the Ninth Army collapsed not only due to the shock of enemy air superiority, but also because a colonel poised to blow up a bridge over the Meuse was killed by a civilian, as per Weygand's claim. An armored division also retreated after receiving a false order. Some even included saboteurs among their suspicions of the fifth column. With Pétain and Weygand by his side, Reynaud addressed the Senate on May 21st, warning the country was in peril. Amiens and Arras had fallen to the enemy. The Allies had dispatched their best troops to the wrong locations, due to incredible mistakes that would lead to punishment. The bridges over the Meuse weren't destroyed to slow the enemy's advance, which was not truthful. And the Ninth Army, under General André Corop, was completely disorganized. He had been relieved of his command. Reynaud concluded by promising no delay in punishing the traitors, the saboteurs, and the cowards. He ended with the powerful statement, "If I were told tomorrow that only a miracle could save France, I would say, I believe in miracles because I believe in France." Meanwhile, as Allied forces withdrew from Belgium and northern France, German armored units and motorized infantry began to encircle Boulogne and Calais on May 23rd. 1 million Allied troops, including the majority of the British Expeditionary Force, were caught in a tightening trap. On that same day, after retreating from Belgium, Barlone and his unit found themselves in the rural countryside south of Lille, struggling to find news. However, he managed to discover that Gamelin had been replaced by Weygand, which brought him some hope, and heard rumors confirming that the Germans had reached Boulogne. "So we are encircled. It's astonishing. Will we manage to break free, or will we become prisoners?" The entirety of northern France, Belgium, our fortifications, our vast supplies, and hundreds of thousands of soldiers were all at risk of falling into German hands due to this remarkably bold maneuver. The army was aware of the gravity of the situation, but it remained resolute. Still, what a catastrophe. The Daily Herald optimistically proclaimed that the story so far was of no more significance than a slow-motion film of the first punch in a 15-round fight. To anyone examining a map, it was clear that the German armored divisions were overreaching and that the Allies needed to sever the German corridor from both the north and south. The Daily Express asserted that future historians will wonder why strong counterattacks weren't launched immediately before the German tide swelled. Weygand adapted a counterattack plan drawn up by Gamelin prior to his dismissal on May 19th and finalized it 3 days later, receiving approval from the French and British governments. Yet, senior military leaders barely grasped the situation on the ground. According to Weygand's plan, the British Expeditionary Force under Lord Gort and the French First Army, led by General Georges Blanchard, were to attack southward on May 23rd. But the reality on the battlefield was chaotic. A small force led by General Harold Franklin of the British Expeditionary Force moved south too soon near Arras on May 21st, and by May 23rd they found themselves in retreat. Communication between governments and commanders on the ground broke down. Gort chose to abandon the planned counterattack from the Weygand plan, opting to pull back toward the Channel coast. The anticipated French counterattack from the south failed to materialize. This withdrawal of the British Expeditionary Force, combined with the failure of the Weygand plan, soured relations among the Allies. The remaining French, British, and Belgian forces in the north became encircled by enemy troops tightening their grip. There was a brief reprieve when the German High Command issued a Haltbefehl, ordering frontline units to stop and let those behind them catch up. On May 26th, Barlon's unit, weakened by the loss of more than half its men, faced south expecting an Allied pincer movement. The brave soldiers of his division engaged with remarkable courage, though they suffered heavy losses among their officers, who were always at the forefront. That evening, there was a report claiming success, stating that the Germans had been cut off, and all their advanced units between Bapaume and the sea were falling into our hands. It suggested that the Weygand touch was at play, predicting a disastrous end for the German maneuver, which brought joy to the ranks. However, the report was later proven false. Behind closed doors, British government members expressed alarm and disdain for the French military's performance. By May 25th, even the combative Georges Mandel was questioning France's fighting capability. Major General Edward Spears, Churchill's envoy to the French Prime Minister, noted that Mandel implicitly recognized that events had led to more than just a military defeat. He observed that the shock of the unfolding situation had produced a stupefying effect rather than galvanizing the nation. Neither the army nor the professional classes wanted to engage in battle. The nation was fractured, with factions viewing one another as either vaguely or overtly tied to foreign influences. There had been no effort to unite the country, leading to a general failure, a collapse of the entire nation. A few days later, Spears reflected that Mandel was even harsher in his judgment of the French people than he was himself, though he admired Mandel for his clear thinking and the courage with which he confronted the harsh realities. Mandel recognized that the core of France's psychological state was frayed. Spears heard from others that some ministers and knowledgeable individuals were speaking about a moral collapse among the populace. Yet, Mandel's assessment may have been too extreme at this point. As Crémieux-Briac pointed out, local police and administrative officials reported mixed public sentiment. People felt anxious, fearful, and angry, yet also showed signs of confidence. This confidence was delicate, but it was there. The commissioner of the administrative police reported from Moulins on May 27th, saying the Prime Minister's address on May 21st, which revealed the mistakes made and the grave nature of the situation, had disheartened the public. It's hard to know how much worse reactions might have been had the ministerial reshuffle and the appointment of General Weygand not coincided with the bad news. The fact that some were openly accusing the High Command of treason illustrates how tense public sentiment was. At the same time, the influx of refugees and their heartbreaking treks had given people a stark understanding of the realities of war. Additionally, the poorly organized evacuation led to chaos and worsened feelings of demoralization. The refugees, mingling with locals and sharing their harrowing experiences, unintentionally fueled a sense of pessimism. All of this painted a grim picture, and many feared defeat, already contemplating the terrifying prospect of a German victory. Other concerns seemed less pressing. Tension ran high regarding the war's progression, yet even the most pessimistic held on to a flicker of hope. The mood shifted continually. Authorities monitoring phone calls and mail found that by the final week of May, people were feeling as though the military situation might be improving. By May 28th, 2.5 weeks into the conflict, Georges Friedman reflected in his diary that it was too early to fully understand the reasons behind France's setbacks. A Marxist sociologist, serving as an army lieutenant in Laon's hospital, Friedman observed that the military's personal shortcomings could have been corrected if the French army had been more modern, disciplined, and well-equipped to match their enemy. The issues of technical and organizational flaws, along with a lack of resolve, had been exacerbated by the chaos following the enemy's invasion and breakthrough at Sedan. The chaos and demoralization left a lasting stain. Yet at that moment, he and his comrades didn't seem to feel the looming threat of a swift German victory over France. The military situation was worsening. On May 27th, King Leopold III of Belgium requested a ceasefire from the Germans, and his surrender was announced the next day. French and British leaders reacted with a mix of outrage and not-so-shocking surprise. Renault publicly denounced Leopold as a traitor for acting without constitutional authority or his government's approval. He became an easy scapegoat. Meanwhile, British and French troops trapped in Dunkirk were being evacuated by sea back to Britain, initially intending to return to France to continue the fight. This evacuation wrapped up on June 4th. In total, over 335,000 soldiers were saved and transported to England, with about two-thirds being British and a third French, alongside some Belgians. The Dunkirk evacuation was viewed as both a defeat and a victory, and perceptions varied greatly between the French and the British. For many, it took time to grasp its full military and political implications. For Jean Chauvel, who kept working in his ministry in Paris until June 9th, the Dunkirk evacuation seemed miraculous. We had initially thought, perhaps naively, that without a continuous front, we could hold a bridgehead along the Channel to England. The Belgian surrender and the rapid constriction of the pocket made us fear total loss. The announcement of the embarkations, thanks to our rearguard's brave defense and the heroic efforts of our sailors alongside the English, lifted our spirits. Honor and many lives had been preserved. We reassured ourselves. Finally, the French army had fought back against the enemy's ambitions. The feeling of embarrassment and shame that had weighed on us for 2 weeks began to lift. This sense of humiliation was typical for those who had surrendered. However, for many French leaders, including Pétain and Weygand, Dunkirk became a symbol of their British allies' selfishness. Weygand was convinced that the Allies were doomed to military defeat. On May 29th, he presented a memorandum to Renault, advocating for an armistice. Renault opposed this idea. The two would engage in numerous disputes over how to conclude the fighting. Ordinary Parisians found the Dunkirk evacuation drama largely irrelevant, as stated by Chauvel. The German advance at Sedan had caused a brief uproar, but it seemed too surreal to grasp. The government had declared it would not abandon Paris. The city had never looked more serene or vibrant. Those days were blessed with wonderful weather, and we longed for rain to mire the German tanks in mud. That peaceful feeling was shattered on June 3rd, when the city faced bombing, resulting in the deaths of hundreds of civilians. For Geoffrey Cox of the Daily Express, it felt like someone had marred the beauty of a lovely woman. The air raid sparked profound sympathy for the French people, igniting our determination to bring down those responsible for the violence, noted the Daily Mail. That evening, Duff Cooper addressed British listeners from Paris, expressing that the French were acutely aware they were fighting for their lives. He described the French as tough and distinct, often challenging for us to understand, but possessing two vital qualities: love for their country and the bravery to die for it. As long as our two nations remained united, there was no need for fear. Two such peoples, even standing alone together, could not be defeated, and they weren't alone. In truth, the British military presence in France was minimal at that point, consisting only of a single division under General Victor Fortune. To bolster our alliance, Churchill ordered the deployment of 2 additional divisions to France, which began arriving on June 13th. However, by then, the French military situation seemed dire. Following the insistence of Corps Commander General Alan Brooke, the 2 divisions were almost immediately sent back. The Luftwaffe had established air superiority early on in the campaign, despite suffering significant losses. The absence of Allied aircraft was a frequent concern. Friedman noted in his diary the recurring theme: overhead, German planes constantly fly, while there are no French planes, machine gunning and bombings at a close distance. The French appealed to the RAF for increased support, creating a dilemma for British commanders who wanted to ensure they had enough forces to protect the British Isles. By May 12th, 10 British fighter squadrons were stationed in France. Renault pressed Churchill and the British War Cabinet for an additional 10 squadrons. The French plea for aerial reinforcements would be repeated numerous times as the ground battle unfolded. However, as defeat seemed more inevitable, the British hesitation to deploy more aircraft hardened into a definite refusal, contributing to the eventual collapse of the alliance. With the capture of Dunkirk, German forces extended their control from the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and Belgium to encompass all of northern France, reaching a line above the Somme and Aisne rivers. Defeat began to weigh heavily on the minds of many. On June 1st, Claude Jammet, a left-wing teacher and activist, reflected in his diary on why France faced inevitable defeat. Inverting Renault's phrase, "We will win because we are the strongest," he predicted, "We will be defeated because we are the least strong." He acknowledged that while they may be the richest, most civilized, and friendliest, they were ultimately the weakest, the least resilient, the slowest, the least passionate, and the least cunning. After winning the Battle of the North, the Germans shifted their focus southward. On June 5th, they launched Case Red, attacking the Somme and Aisne rivers from the north. The French fortified their defensive lines, known as the Wagen Line. At first, their forces held firm and fought valiantly. The fighting was intense, and it seemed the Wagen Line would endure. Yet, the disparity in numbers proved too significant. The French faced about 40 infantry divisions with remnants of 3 armored divisions, whereas the Germans fielded 50 infantry and 3 panzer divisions, despite having sustained losses. On June 6th, German forces breached the Somme line west of Amiens, and on June 10th, they overcame the Aisne line. Rouen fell to German control. As German troops closed in on Paris, journalist Alexander Wirth prepared to depart. He wished he would never have to endure another month like that again. As life carried on with its routine, the weight of impending doom loomed over Paris and its people every single moment. The sheer tragedy of it all was overwhelming. Why was France losing? On the 8th of June, banker Paul Baudouin, who served as a Secretary of State in Renaud's office, noted in his diary that Weygand highlighted the challenges he faced. He discovered a French army that had clung to a single idea since the war started 8 months earlier. There's no need for action. We will prevail. This passive mindset, rooted in 2 decades of neglect, weakness, and demagoguery, needed to be dismantled. The soldiers showed signs of improvement, exhibiting a fighting spirit, yet behind the front lines, a laid-back, almost defeatist attitude persisted. It was unrealistic for regional commanders to change long-standing habits of laziness and disregard overnight. The Prime Minister went further, stating that for 8 months, the army had been allowed to be idle, believing, "You won't need to fight, the enemy will crumble on its own." Soldiers had become akin to agricultural laborers instead of receiving proper training in discipline and combat. Marshal Pétain echoed these concerns, expressing horror at the daily evidence of the army's lack of preparation. Nothing has been done for months, or rather for years. Everything in this country must be rebuilt from the ground up. On the 5th of June, the day the new German offensive began, Renault initiated another reshuffle, naming Colonel Charles de Gaulle as Under-Secretary of State for Defense. As the Germans advanced southward, the government fled Paris on the 10th of June to set up in Touraine, with ministries scattered among various country estates. Communication lines were sparse, contributing to a sense of chaos. On that same day, Italy declared war on France and Britain, and Reims fell to German troops the following day. Amid all this turmoil, millions of refugees were on the move, jamming roads, creating disruptions, and occasionally looting abandoned properties along their path. What became known as the Exodus began in May, when refugees from Belgium and Luxembourg poured into France, soon joined by people from the northern French departments. By early June, as the German forces pushed forward, the wave of refugees included those from the Seine and Loire regions, all heading toward the Loire River. The numbers swelled to astonishing figures, estimated at between 8 and 10 million. the population of Paris saw a sharp decline, and other towns and villages in the path of the invaders were partially deserted. In many places, local officials abandoned their duties. One who remained was Jean Moulin, the prefect of Chartres and future resistance leader. He noted that by June 14th, the town's usual population of 23,000 had shrunk to only 700 or 800. The situation was dire, with no economic or administrative structure left in place. An entire social system lay in ruins under horrific conditions amidst bombardments, with a quarter of the town in flames and lacking water, gas, electricity, and phone service. In mid-June, Friedman described a railway station in the Loire region resembling a Russian station from around 1930. There's luggage piled high, bundles and crates scattered everywhere, while people waiting for trains for 2 days slumped exhausted on whatever they could find. Journalist Gordon Waterfeld remarked that the French were too civilized to handle the fallout from the Exodus. They wouldn't resort to the harsh tactics of the Germans. Instead of forcing refugees and soldiers to hold their ground by any means necessary, they let them surge through France like a swarm of locusts, obstructing communications and disrupting military movements. Writer Alfred Faber-Luce believed that Hitler had anticipated how his bombers and Fifth Column would generate a massive, growing snowball of millions of refugees, spreading fear and famine and inducing panic among troops moving north. Friedman's subsequent take was more nuanced. He viewed the Fifth Column as an occurrence born spontaneously from the sometimes ridiculous rumors sparked by the panic of the refugees and rumors manipulated by the invaders. It turned into a kind of mass hysteria that Hitler had counted on, and he had won his gamble. He felt as though an entire nation had suddenly collapsed. The Exodus was a chaotic and terrifying experience filled with suffering for millions of French citizens, along with some foreigners. This turmoil generated many first-hand accounts, one of the most well-known being penned by journalist and novelist Léon Werth in June 1940, published later on. On the day enemy forces took Reims, June 11th, a crucial meeting of the Supreme War Council of the Allies occurred at the Château du Muguet in Briare. Weygand stated that while the French army had fought bravely, it was nearing the end of its strength, and it was time to cease hostilities. The following day, as French ministers gathered for the first time since leaving Paris, Weygand informed them that a coordinated military defense was no longer feasible and that France should pursue an armistice. The ensuing debate lasted until June 16th, centered on whether to negotiate peace with the enemy or relocate the government to North Africa to continue the fight. If they chose the latter, the army would surrender in the field, just as Norway and the Netherlands had. Their monarchs and governments had found refuge in London. However, on June 12th, Weygand dismissed this option, not wanting the army to shoulder the blame for the defeat alone. They decided to invite Churchill for a meeting the next day to discuss the situation. During the last meeting of the Supreme War Council on June 13th, Churchill did not outright reject the idea of allowing France to break its commitment to avoid a separate peace. He agreed with Renault that they should reach out to the United States for support in the interim. Later that day, as French ministers reconvened, Pétain officially stated that the government had a duty to remain in France, effectively ruling out a retreat to Britain or North Africa. On that day, Baudouin noted that he was now clear about his position. The French army is utterly defeated, and one must confront this reality to try to preserve, by all honorable means, the other forces of the country. France is not just a piece of land, but a fragile tapestry of civilization, rich in spiritual, moral, and intellectual values. She represents the essence of Western civilization. France could not endure a full invasion and a complete disruption of its fragile balance. Its military and administrative structure would crumble. Without any opposing force, Nazi rule would deeply wound the nation's spirit. A French government must care for the country in its time of need. We cannot allow the German army to take 4 million prisoners, nor let the enemy's air force bomb the roads where millions of women and children are fleeing. The slaughter has lost its meaning. The battle is over, with no hope of recovery. We must halt the occupation of all of metropolitan France in a way that protects the future. We also need to defend North Africa, which cannot withstand an attack. That evening, Renault reached out to President Roosevelt over the radio, stating, "We need swarms of planes from across the Atlantic to crush the force that is crushing Europe." Barlow noted in his diary that they listened to the radio at 7:30 p.m., hearing Renault's message to Roosevelt, pleading for American support and involvement in the war. They were stunned. This message was a desperate call of the defeated, foreseeing the fall of Paris and leading the government to retreat to a province of France, then to North Africa, and if necessary, to their possessions in America. While I understand his aim in sending this message to Roosevelt to encourage American involvement, broadcasting it throughout France only highlights impending withdrawals and signals defeat, the total loss of our land. Is that truly how to motivate our troops or ease the fears of those behind the lines? Doesn't it instead plant the seeds of panic? Was this necessary, or have we genuinely reached that point? The military governor of Paris, General Pierre Herring, declared the city an open one. German troops marched into a nearly deserted Paris on Friday, June 14th at noon. The fall of the capital sent ripples around the globe. Prices plummeted sharply on the London exchange. The Daily Mail warned, "What has happened to Paris can happen to London." The Daily Mirror stated, "Paris was part of London. France is part of ourselves. One part is gone or going, the next is here at home." The Manchester Guardian expressed relief that the beautiful city had been spared the bombings seen in Warsaw and Rotterdam. As the swastika flew over the city and German tanks rolled by the Arc de Triomphe, the Daily Express remarked that it was pointless to feel sentimental about Paris's fall. The French chose to safeguard their beautiful non-military target rather than fight for it street by street. Yet it was hard for the French not to feel the weight of emotion. The conscripted writer Robert Christophe was taken aback, exclaiming, "The Germans walking down the Champs-Élysées! My God, come help us!" The Daily Herald stated they couldn't find words for their grief, saying their hearts were too heavy. The Daily Sketches columnist Beverly Nichols confessed he couldn't eat all day. To J.L. Garvin, editor of The Observer, Paris's fall was the most remarkable and tragic event of this war, destined to linger in memory. Private Wire echoed a sentiment from Sir Edward Grey in 1914, describing it as a great light of civilization dimming. News trickled out throughout the day, culminating in an official announcement displayed on newspaper stalls. The chill that accompanied seeing that news would forever haunt them through the war's course. Paris had become a silent city. Barlow believed Russia needed to realize that Hitler would eventually turn against them. On the evening of June 14th, reports of Soviet troop movements along the German border raised a flicker of hope. On June 15th, Friedman encountered some officers in Thouars and was unsettled by how easily they accepted defeat. They were already planning their revenge, dismissing Hitler as mad. "He's a madman with immense intelligence. This campaign has been conducted skillfully," they claimed without a hint of concern that France would soon surrender. What shocked Friedman most was the chaos behind the lines, the indifference of some citizens, and the corrupt behavior of many fleeing, who spread exaggerated and even ludicrous rumors. There was a ready-made, willing fifth column that the invaders could count on. On the same day Paris fell and German forces advanced south, the government departed Touraine for Bordeaux. There, on June 15th, ministers reconvened to reassess the possibility of an armistice or alternative options. Weygand, whose tense relationship with Renault had become irreparable, refused to accept a military capitulation similar to that of the Dutch and insisted instead on pursuing an armistice. This stance could have led to his dismissal for disobeying civil authority, but Renault hesitated to take action. Later that day, Deputy Prime Minister Camille Chautemps suggested not to request an armistice outright, but to ask the enemy about the potential terms should one be sought. The distinction was subtle, to say the least. On the morning of June 16th, Pétain threatened to resign if an armistice was not pursued. Meanwhile, Roosevelt responded with sympathy, but offered little more. The British government tentatively proposed agreeing to a separate armistice, provided the French fleet sailed to British ports. Later that day, this communication was replaced by an offer for a Franco-British union. As R.T. Thomas described, it was certainly an ambitious proposal. France and Britain would form a single nation, with shared defense, foreign and economic policies, joint citizenship, a unified war cabinet, and connected parliaments. Despite the momentary enthusiasm from Reynaud and de Gaulle for this radical plan, French ministers either rejected the offer outright as irrelevant to the military crisis or regarded it with indifference. Some dismissed the notion of France becoming a British dominion, while others believed Britain would ultimately have to negotiate with Hitler as well. This drama unfolded in a city overflowing with refugees, including politicians and officials. According to Spears, on June 16th, as the government grappled with its future direction, the senators and deputies he encountered largely favored an immediate peace. They weren't focused on France's honor, but rather on their own constituencies and job security. Surrender instead of sacrifice was central to their thoughts and discussions. The overwhelming tide of defeat had engulfed even the gestures of defiance. The once dynamic response seen across all social classes in France since the German onslaught has now dulled into a deep sense of helplessness. Some resembled birds ensnared by glue, while others were like rabbits mesmerized by a predator, their gaze fixed on the Germans as if facing an unavoidable fate. For these people, discussions about British resistance felt as awkward as showing up inappropriately dressed for an occasion, as insensitive as challenging a person without legs to run, as out of place as a bugle in a funeral home. The discussions around an armistice, limited to about 25 individuals, centered on clashing ideologies, worldviews, and logical assessments. Neither the National Assembly nor public sentiment mattered in the internal conflict between those favoring an armistice and those advocating for continuing the fight alongside Britain. Supporters of military surrender believed that Britain, shielded by its island status and backed by the French fleet, its own empire, and American resources, would persist in the struggle, eventually shifting the balance against Germany. Conversely, those in favor of an armistice contended that Britain couldn't secure victory and would ultimately need to negotiate with Hitler. They argued that historically, Britain had often acted against French interests, and there was no chance of temporarily handing over the French fleet to them. They claimed that the French Empire was too fragmented and economically feeble to sustain a long-term war effort, fearing it would fall prey to British greed and encroachment. Reynaud, overwhelmed by the crisis, resigned on June 16th, making way for Pétain, who was appointed prime minister by President Albert Lebrun. Pétain swiftly established a new government and, through the Spanish ambassador, sought an armistice from the Germans. The request was communicated in the early hours of June 17th. Later that day, Pétain announced his request over the radio, declaring, "We must stop the fighting." Many interpreted this as a signal that combat would cease immediately. The following day, the press revised his statement to soften its impact, changing it to, "We must try to stop the fighting." On June 18th, the government declared all cities and towns with populations over 20,000 to be open. In London, General Charles de Gaulle, now in self-imposed exile and no longer a minister, proclaimed that although the battle was lost, the war continued and urged France to fight alongside Britain. He called for volunteers to join him in London to carry on the struggle. For many in France, Pétain's announcement to cease fighting stirred a mix of shock, confusion, shame, relief, and even elation. The writer Jacques-Benoît Méchain recalled that upon hearing Pétain's speech, a loud outcry filled the air, mixed with honking horns from cars. "It's over! The war is finished! Long live Pétain! Long live the Marshal!" people shouted, waving their arms, embracing one another, and tossing their hats in the air. Tears flowed, but was it joy or sorrow? It certainly wasn't joy. Perhaps it was despair? No, it felt more like a deep relief, a sudden release of the tension that had been almost unbearable. I, too, felt a lump in my throat and tears welling in my eyes. I had to step away, to escape the chaos, to find a moment of silence to reflect and regain my composure. For Friedman, Pétain's announcement didn't come as a shock, but it was still a heavy blow. It was the triple shame of men weeping, of France inflicting wounds upon itself and upon England at the same time. It was madness to part from England. He believed Renault had not been the great leader some had imagined. He allowed himself to be disgracefully ousted in the face of dire danger. He lamented the decline in public spirit and the lack of civic responsibility among many of the middle class, which negatively impacted the working class. Barlone noted that upon hearing Pétain had called for an armistice, several officers wept bitterly while others stood in silence, rendered speechless by the catastrophe. A few days later, he found it baffling that the marshal had ordered the army not to resist or escape. Perhaps he had a secret plan. After all, Pétain couldn't be a traitor, he thought, but quickly dismissed the idea as impossible. On June 19th, the Germans responded to the armistice request. French officials were summoned to Rethonde, close to Compiègne, to receive the terms from the enemy. The following day, German forces occupied Tours, Strasbourg, Brest, and Montluçon. On June 22nd, the armistice was signed in the very railway carriage that had hosted the 1918 armistice with the German Empire. Another armistice with Italy was finalized in Rome on June 24th. Fighting ceased when both armistices took effect at 12:35 a.m. on June 25th, which the French government declared a day of national mourning. Meanwhile, La Rochelle, Poitiers, Saint-Étienne, and Angoulême were also occupied. Between Pétain's broadcast and the armistice's implementation, about 1 million French soldiers surrendered or were captured as prisoners. After 6 weeks of conflict, more than 60,000 French soldiers lost their lives, including those whose outcomes remained uncertain. An additional 2,650 would die in July and August from their injuries, while approximately 123,000 were injured. Around 1.8 million soldiers ended up as prisoners of war, initially housed in France before most were sent to camps in Germany, where many would stay until the war's conclusion. These were mainly troops from the 3rd, 5th, and 8th French armies stationed in the Alsace-Lorraine and Vosges regions. It's estimated that, among the roughly 8 million individuals who became internal refugees, several hundred lost their lives on the roads due to German aircraft. The International Red Cross reported that around 90,000 children were separated from their families amid the chaos of evacuation. Months would pass before many of these refugees were permitted to return to their homes in the north. The material devastation from the fighting was particularly severe in the northeast, the same areas that had suffered during the previous war, with an estimated 400,000 houses destroyed. As Henri Dumoulin de Labarthette, who would become Pétain's private office chief, depicted, France in the summer of 1940 seemed like a hospital of the severely wounded, bruised men who dreamed the dream of all convalescence. A bright house, fresh linen, a woman's gaze, pastures as far as the eye could see. The terms of the armistice with Germany, reluctantly accepted by the French government after a half-hearted attempt to negotiate, were harsh. They aimed to discourage France from continuing the fight from North Africa and to persuade Britain to abandon the struggle. France was permitted to keep its naval fleet and colonial holdings. The French government could stay in power, maintaining control over its national territory and empire, but German soldiers occupied 3/5 of the mainland, including the entire Atlantic coastline from Bordeaux onward. The economically significant occupied northern zone was separated from the unoccupied southern zone by a demarcation line, which the Germans quickly exploited for their economic gain. This led to the evacuation of German troops from Lyon. France had to shoulder the cost of occupation at a staggering rate of 20 million Reichsmarks daily, which devalued the franc by 40%, converting it to 20 francs per mark and boosting the purchasing power of the occupiers. This charge equated to 400 million francs each day, sufficient to support an occupying army of 18 million men, rather than the actual 500,000. All military equipment was to be surrendered to Germany, and the French army was limited to 100,000 personnel to ensure law and order. The French naval fleet was to be demobilized but would remain under French control, with each ship anchored at its home port. This was later modified to allow the fleet to protect France's colonies. All German soldiers, civilians, and political refugees in France were to be handed over. Moreover, French soldiers taken prisoner by Germany were designated as prisoners of war until a peace treaty was signed, effectively making them hostages. The French government anticipated a peace treaty was close once Britain withdrew from the conflict, a belief some held in the early summer of 1940. The Germans retained the right to invalidate the armistice and renew hostilities against France. According to Dumoulin, the armistice felt as inevitable as a storm's arrival. It wasn't an act of salvation, betrayal, or an admission of defeat. Rather, it helped avert a situation where the Wehrmacht would quickly take North Africa. This was a discussion that would persist. In a broadcast on June 17th, Pétain spoke of striving for a dignified armistice between soldiers. The outcome was far from honorable, leading his government to conceal the details of the armistice from the French populace. The press, for instance, never disclosed the enormity of the financial burden placed on France by the Germans for their occupation. For a significant time, these figures remained undisclosed. Furthermore, the press could not report on the severe unilateral measures taken almost instantly by the Germans, which violated the agreement. These measures involved assigning the Nord and Pas-de-Calais departments to the German military administration of Belgium, creating a prohibited buffer zone that separated them from the rest of occupied France. A special zone was established for German settlers, barring French refugees from returning. By August 1940, the three departments of Alsace-Lorraine were effectively annexed. The French government relocated from Bordeaux, now within the occupied zone, to Clermont-Ferrand on June 29, before settling in Vichy on July 1st, where it remained until nearly the end of the occupation in 1944. Meanwhile, British officials and de Gaulle sought to persuade French colonial administrators and military leaders to reject the armistice and continue fighting. As it became evident that most of the empire eventually submitted to the authority of the Vichy government, de Gaulle was recognized by the British as the leader of Free Frenchmen on June 27th. Britain's diplomatic ties with France entered a state of uncertainty. Concerned about the possibility of French forces falling under German control, Churchill ordered their neutralization theories of operations across Britain, Egypt, and French North Africa, including the seizure of French ships in British ports. The most dramatic event occurred on July 3rd, when British forces attacked French naval vessels at Mers el-Kébir near Oran in North Africa, resulting in the death of nearly 1,300 French sailors. The Vichy government subsequently severed diplomatic relations with Britain and bombed Gibraltar. Though the material damage was minimal, the psychological impact was substantial. This sparked a wave of Franco-British blame in the press of both nations, igniting latent Anglophobia in France into a visible outburst. The French press, under German or Vichy control, operated without restraint. In contrast to many of his fellow countrymen, economist and banker Charles Rist held a rather distinctive perspective. Churchill's actions at Mers el-Kébir highlighted the tragedy of Britain's predicament more than anything else. The British would have had more justification for their harshness toward France had they directed their attacks at German and Italian warships. Their apparent lack of fighting spirit seems almost pathological, and their ignorance of the enemy's mindset is truly tragic. Meanwhile, rumors were spreading about impending political changes in Vichy. Historians widely agree that the military defeat induced a deep crisis of legitimacy for the current regime, a common consequence in such situations. Some of Pétain's closest associates contended that the parliamentary system of the Third Republic had caused the nation's woes, arguing that a sitting parliament would hinder the efficiency of his government. It needed to be dismissed. For Barlone and his peers, Pétain and Weygand were merely a facade for the group of politicians who had taken control. Barlone feared the government was planning to impose a distorted constitution on the nation before demobilizing the army and sending soldiers home, where, enjoying a bit more freedom, they might voice their protests against the harsh realities they faced. Today, when we should unite to resist the enemy, a French marshal hastily gathers parliament so we might accept the enemy's final blow without any resistance. Good God, where are we headed? De Gaulle must come to our aid. Just imagine feeling and witnessing this while allowing malicious hands to betray us, rob us, and drag us through the mud, all while we feel powerless to shout thief or murder. Our internal fury is palpable. The prediction came true. Just 4 days later, on July 10th, members of the National Assembly convened at the Grand Casino in Vichy. Encouraged by Pétain's supporters, led by Pierre Laval, they voted 570 to 80 to grant Marshal Pétain sweeping powers to shape France's future constitutional framework. This abdication without style, as Olivier Wieve-Yorka puts it, marked the end of the Third Republic and would spark extensive debates for years to come concerning the true circumstances of the vote, the motivations of individual parliamentarians, and the decay or resilience of the waning regime. It played right into the hands of those who argued that the regime was to blame for the military defeat. Reflecting on the vote of July 10th, 1940, often described as parliamentary harakiri, Jean-Pierre Azéma finds it astonishing. However, as Henri Michel points out in his book Vichy Année 40, many at the time viewed the rise of the new regime through a different lens. The nation faced all the signs of disintegration, a profound sense of helplessness after the fall of an army once thought invincible, the resentment of the French feeling abandoned by their allies, frustration over being led into disaster by incompetent leaders, shock at the overwhelming strength of the enemy, and the allure of capitulation. There was also a strong desire to identify and hold accountable those who had contributed to the national tragedy, sparking new conflicts and divisions. Amidst this turmoil, only one figure emerged strengthened from the chaos: Marshal Pétain. He radiated a calm authority and confidence that grew into genuine power, eventually leading to his legal authority. He appeared to transcend factional divides, positioning himself as the sole individual capable of uniting the French people and securing France's future with the victor. From the outset, the French expressed gratitude towards him for halting the fighting and, as they believed, alleviating the associated suffering. They were ready to follow him anywhere. He implicitly laid out 3 options: a break from England, a new regime that rejected the Third Republic's laws and customs, and an agreement with the victor to ensure France's survival. How did the French respond to their defeat? Understandably, reactions varied. Some resolved to resist in whatever way possible. Barlone was determined to fight on and aimed to reach England to join de Gaulle, refusing to accept that France, developed over a millennium and boasting a magnificent colonial empire, would perish in a month at the hands of a butcher. But for most, the defeat was a harrowing shock. For Alexis Léger, the newly dismissed secretary of the French Foreign Office preparing to go into exile in June 1940, it became the most horrific time of his life as a Frenchman. In his memoir, I Remember, André Maurois recounts being in England when Pétain made his broadcast. He shared, "I locked myself in my room, collapsed onto my bed, and cried like a child." Historians have tried to delve into the resulting trauma. Jean-Paul Brunet observes that the army's collapse, the shock of defeat, and the disintegration of society profoundly disturbed the mindset of those living through it. The humiliation that came with defeat led many to question their country's value. Jean-Pierre Azéma and Olivier Wieve-Yorka warn that underestimating the trauma of the French military defeat and the deep identity crisis that ensued in the summer of 1940 risks missing the essence of the dark years during the occupation. The majority of the French lost their political bearings, clung to their blind faith in the victor of Verdun, accepted his strategies for metropolitan France, and cautiously withdrew into themselves. In his notable essay on the trauma, Stanley Hoffmann highlights 2 key aspects of the defeat. The first is a powerful sense of catastrophe, a feeling that an otherworldly event suddenly intruded into everyday life with astonishing speed, delivering harsh, unexpected blows to both heart and mind. This created a dual displacement, physical or geographical, seen in the exodus, prison camps, exile, or escape to London for some individuals, and mental, as the forces of history that had long been lurking now burst forth violently, dragging individuals from their private lives into the collective experience. The second aspect is the humiliation, even shame, which people faced. Attempts to combat this included recalling acts of French heroism on the battlefield and presenting various excuses, legitimate or not, such as the Fifth Column, German military superiority, and unreliable allies. During this time, Jacques-Benoît Méchain described intense feelings of humiliation and shame. A common reaction to this trauma was the widespread cry of treason, an unshakable conviction that could never be erased and which would have lasting consequences. For other prisoners of war, it became the only certainty they had left, a conviction that Benoît Méchain felt neither the courage nor the right to challenge or explain. He too experienced the shame of what he, his fellow soldiers, and France had become. What was left to hold on to? For Fabre-Luce, the swift nature of the defeat at least offered the sad consolation that it wasn't a repetition of the great slaughter of 1914 to 1918. Reports from prefects, phone taps, opened letters, and Secret Service intelligence indicated that most of the French populace welcomed the armistice, supported Pétain, and accepted the regime change with either confidence or indifference. The exception was the Nord Department, under German military command, where there was less acceptance of the armistice and some sympathy for de Gaulle. Pierre Laborie suggests that amidst the chaos, speaking of public opinion in the early summer of 1940 is nearly meaningless. Those millions, consumed by anger and the struggle for survival, were politically adrift and grabbed onto the lifebuoy that was Marshal Pétain. However, rightly or wrongly, they also sensed, as Andrew Shenin noted, that the defeat was more than just a military loss. Initial attempts to explain the defeat became a topic of endless discussion. "We talked endlessly," reflected diplomat John Chauvel later. J.L. Garvin had a different perspective, likening the fall of France to the new apocalypse, stating that there is no language of Patmos. Our modern words are withered by inconceivable events. Some sought a coherent explanation for the disaster. In his journal, writer and teacher John Gehenno recounted a conversation with an old history teacher on June 13, 1940. He inquired about the reasons for the swift catastrophe, and the teacher responded, we shouldn't look for the causes nearby in our recent history. It's the result of a tragedy that has been unfolding for over a century. The get-rich spirit of the bourgeoisie has ultimately eradicated democracy. It has spread like contagion from the bourgeois to the peasants and workers. Republican virtue is lost. There are no more peoples, no more men, only the masses. That is why the Republic has fallen. In Dumoulin's view, many French people struggled to accept that the turmoil was caused by the shortcomings of the armed forces and their leadership. People felt betrayed, believing the disaster could only be understood as the result of a conspiracy, a notion spread, much to his dismay, by certain foreign journalists. It was far simpler to assign blame than to offer explanations, and there were plenty of targets to criticize, including the former regime, for their failings and wrongdoings. A peasant from Haute-Savoie told Charles Rist that the defeat stemmed from poor governance and underperforming, overpaid teachers. When Rist pushed back, the peasant admitted his reasoning lacked credibility. Pierre Cot, a former Popular Front minister, now in the USA, argued that the events of June 1940 were the inevitable result of 2 decades of accumulated mistakes. However, trying to untangle those mistakes from the resulting chaos quickly became entangled in confusion, heated arguments, and counterclaims. Meanwhile, those less inclined to dissect the issue were drawn to the idea of treason. Treason by the Belgian king for surrendering, treason by the British for abandoning a small army, treason by communists, and so on. The list appeared never-ending. The outcry of treason would resonate for years. It was a broad enough term to encompass both military defeat and political disintegration, often seen as a collective crime. Treason was attributed to conspirators, whether foreign or French, and from across the political spectrum. It was perceived as the handiwork of hidden forces within France's economic, political, and military elite. The name most frequently mentioned among these was the Cagoule, a far-right terrorist group known for a failed coup in 1937 and the assassination of then-Interior Minister Marx Dormoy. Another group often brought up were the synarchists, financiers, technocrats, and graduates of elite engineering schools who were alleged to conspire to establish an authoritarian, technocratic government. The term fifth column was another convenient label for perceived traitors, even if it wasn't entirely accurate. For Louis Lévy, a former diplomatic and war correspondent for the socialist newspaper Le Populaire, Writing from exile in England, the fifth column was made up of French fascism colluding with foreign fascism. He noted that Hitler's agents in France displayed remarkable skill and diversity alongside a deep comprehension of French psychology. Their main operative, Otto Abetz, adeptly exploited the snobbery of the elite and the pacifism of the working class. The fascist media managed to sway many respectable middle-class individuals against the prospect of forming an alliance with Russia. The corruption ran deep, with the entire social framework decaying. Fascist influence was steadily spreading, eroding the morale of the nation. In another vivid image, one might liken it to a worm gnawing at the best parts of the fruit, ushering in decay. Those in power failed to grasp the true essence of Hitlerism. While Levi believed that Weygand didn't desire to surrender his country, tied to the Führer, he still foresaw a preference for that over a revolution, the Popular Front, or rule by the rabble. Yet, even when one attempts to justify the actions of Weygand, Baudouin, and certain figures within the Pétain cabinet, questions linger. Weygand, Baudouin, and their counterparts merely embodied the views of the French elite, convinced their choices would resonate with these classes, blinded by class bias. They also understood that some factions among the middle and even working classes would accept them without much resistance. They were right in their belief because the French fascists had worked tirelessly to unify these disparate groups, whether under the guise of protecting property or peace, thus turning them into unwitting participants in fascism. If figures like Baudouin were able to rise to power, even with the nation's apparent aversion to fascism in past votes, it was due to years of diligent efforts by the French fascists, which sowed confusion and chaos among the various strata of society. According to Cott, the actions of the fifth column won't be seen by historians as an isolated incident within French public life, but rather as a fundamental component of fascism. The fifth column wasn't merely composed of spies and traitors. It included anyone who, by embracing fascist ideas or tactics, became either a conscious or unconscious accomplice of a foreign power. The general staff of this fifth column was mainly made up of ambitious individuals seeking to gain power by undermining the democratic system. They fueled fears of communism, citing examples from journalists like Pierre Lazareff, Elie Boas, and Geneviève Tabouis, as well as politicians such as Henri de Kerillis, Anatole de Manzy, and Henry Torres. Even resistance leader Georges Bidault, the newspaper L'Humanité, and thinkers like Jacques Maritain, Yves Simon, Albert Gerard, and Pertinax contributed to this narrative. However, there was no evidence to prove that Pétain and Weygand were part of any conspiracy. History will search for this evidence. Until more details emerge, their admiration for fascism and disdain for democracy appear to explain their actions, which may have led them to overestimate Hitler's strength while underestimating the British will to resist. Only time will reveal if their support for Hitler stemmed from incompetence or treason. Yet Cott believed the cause of the defeat was clear. The backing of the reactionary bourgeoisie for fascism was the key factor in France's downfall, the root cause unifying the various elements of defeat. This fear of communism caused panic and halted any potential for closer relations with Russia. It instilled in the French bourgeoisie a respect for Hitler that birthed the fifth column. The Cagoulards played a significant role in this shift, showing a preference for Hitler over Léon Blum. Every step of the way, the betrayal by the French haute bourgeoisie is evident. This class bears the blame for the defeat, with the Vichy government serving merely as its tool. Henri de Kerillis, exiled in America and the only right-wing deputy to oppose the Munich Agreement in 1938, believed that a conspiracy had been in the works long before the war. The old Marshal, he argued, was manipulated by dark forces aiming to elevate him to power through a strategic move by the fifth column. It was a terrifying method that takes a broken old soldier whose spirit and strength have been easily crushed and uses him to tear France apart. This technique resembles a form of medieval sorcery and evokes one of the oddest tales from India. An entire nation suffers through the plight of one individual. Poor Pétain. Another exile in America was the conservative journalist André Giraud, writing under the name Pertinax. He was less forgiving toward Pétain than de Kerillis in his work The Grave Diggers of France. For Pertinax, Pétain represented the symbolic leader of the counter-revolution. When Pétain became prime minister on June 16, 1940, he marked the beginning of what Pertinax called the most shameful chapter in French history, with no parallel in France's extensive past. By requesting an armistice, Pétain and Weygand sacrificed the independence of the nation. Behind them lurked a powerful faction that had been gathering strength since 1934. For 6 years, they had been prepared to make countless concessions to Hitler, ready to trade away French independence to avoid the turmoil of war. They looked to Pétain as their savior. In 1935, the National Socialist Gustave Hervé even published a pamphlet declaring, "It's Pétain we need." The significant achievement of this group lay in establishing Pétain and Weygand as their leaders. From this emerged a conspiracy that had only occasionally shown signs of life, which, had it not been for military defeat, would have merely lingered in the shadows. Without this audacious crew, Pétain, even with Weygand's support, would never have managed such a complex and far-reaching undertaking. He lacked the boldness. Pertinax described the counter-revolutionary crowd, focusing on figures like Laval, pacifists, the anti-communist and pro-fascist press, as well as the press funded by Italy and Germany, pro-German authors, the Comité France Allemagne, and paramilitary groups like the Croix de Feu, essentially those who have since become the right-wing staples of historical scholarship for this era. Pertinax notably referenced writer Thierry Molnier, who, following the Munich settlement in November 1938, publicly expressed his concerns about the disastrous consequences of any war with Germany, regardless of who emerged victorious. There was a chance that France might lose, leading to devastation. More likely, France would emerge victorious, but would end up crippling Germany. Germany served as France's main defense against a communist uprising. Pertinax neither defined conspiracy nor believed that the counter-revolutionaries before the war had been unstoppable. Their influence was confined to select groups. They didn't dominate the vast majority of the population. When war came, had France possessed a prime minister and military leader truly capable of their roles, they could have easily rendered the few thousand who occasionally rallied into a party powerless. Instead, military defeat gave Pétain and Weygand their opportunity. Was Pétain merely a pawn or the main player? Regardless, most believed he didn't act alone. Following the liberation in 1944, a torrent of leftist publications emerged, accusing people of conspiracy and betrayal. This surge was preceded by a small book that was shared secretly and published in 1944 by Editions du Franc-Tireur, linked to the resistance. Written by Albert Baillet, it claimed Pétain was aligned with Hitler and was the leader of the Fifth Column, having conspired with Hitler to elevate him to power. The idea of a conspiracy involving unscrupulous French elements and international fascism was echoed in a book by anarchist André Lorilleux. Another notable work, The Men Who Betrayed France, was penned by André Simon, a Comintern agent who had been in France illegally during the conflict. In 1945, Maurice Thorez of the French Communist Party stated at its National Congress that France's wealthiest families had openly supported Hitler, believing him to champion their selfish interests. The communists argued that, entangled in a war among competing imperialist forces, the French bourgeoisie colluded to safeguard their own interests. However, as Philippe Bouton points out, these accusations didn't really offer solid explanations for the defeat. The closest it came to doing so was by pointing fingers at inept generals and calling for the death penalty for the so-called traitors: Daladier, Blum, Bonnet, Laval, Flandin, and others, who had imprisoned communists, allowing the traitors to betray the country without fear of repercussions. For the Trotskyists linked to the Fourth International, the explanation was more straightforward. The bourgeoisie always prioritized its wealth and profits over patriotism. When its interests were threatened, the bourgeoisie often succumbed to a sense of defeatism. In 1945, Pétain faced trial. He was charged with allegations of a right-wing conspiracy before the war aimed at dismantling the Republic. The war supposedly led to an authoritarian regime taking its place. Pétain had ties to synarchists and the Cagoule, and he was accused of collaborating with the enemy. However, The court's ruling fell short of proving how these elements constituted a conspiracy against the internal security of the Republic. Moreover, when pressed by the court president to concede that he had conspired with Pétain from 1934 to 1939, witness Pierre Laval responded, "Mr. President, I cannot fabricate a story to suit those interested in it." The accusations of conspiracy and treason were not solely made from the left, as is often assumed. The fascist writer Louis Rebatted believed that the Republic was undermined by a foreign conspiracy. He did not deny that the country's military leaders bore responsibility for the defeat. In his 1942 pamphlet on the fall of France, titled Les Décombres, Rebatted delivered a detailed account of the Battle of France, condemning the army and its officers for their failures. However, he also argued that the Republic's political leaders, particularly Daladier and Renaud, had been influenced by dark forces of international finance, Freemasonry, and Jewish interests, which not only sought to overcome Nazi Germany, but also aimed to profit from arms production. One group that drew fire from both the left and right were the Synarchists, a supposed coalition of technocrats, finance inspectors, and bankers, some connected to the prominent financial institution Bank Worms, which became synonymous with this group. Some Synarchs took on roles as ministers and advisors within the Vichy regime's economic policy. This led to an increase in allegations of hidden dealings. On the left, Charles Dumas, former chief of staff to Marx Dormoy, claimed in his book about the defeat that the Synarchs were behind the cagoule. Meanwhile, on the right, as Olivier Dard points out, Paris collaborationists accused the Synarchs of attempting to sabotage Vichy's national revolution for the benefit of international financial powers dominated by Anglo-American and Jewish interests. Dard explains that these accusations, whether from collaborationists or the resistance, stem from the profound impact of the 1940 defeat, which contemporaries recognized immediately, even if they struggled to agree on its causes or fully comprehend its consequences. Since then, both French and international historians have extensively documented this catastrophe, of which the main facts are well known. Yet the defeat still contains aspects that remain puzzling, particularly when trying to understand how France fell apart in just 6 weeks. The themes of conspiracy and treason resonate strongly, as they still do today. By the 1980s, Robert Paxton, in his updated edition of a landmark study on Vichy, argued that it no longer makes sense to view the defeat and the subsequent Vichy regime solely as acts of betrayal or a secretive plot. Regardless of the actual presence of fifth columns or treason, he contended that these factors alone could not explain the defeat. Research into the German and Allied campaigns indicated that the fall of France should be understood in traditional military terms. However, as Dard notes, the conspiracy and treason narratives persist. One notable figure advocating this perspective is communist sympathizer Annie Lacroix-Ries, who attributes the fall of France largely to conspiratorial actions by Synarchs and Kegoulards. She claims that the Third Republic was intentionally undermined by high-ranking military members of the cagoule, pinpointing specific figures such as General Hunziker and General Korup, whom she alleges were instructed by the conspirators to let Guderian's army break through the French defenses at Sedan. The Germans' breakthrough and swift advancement provided the conspirators with the chance to negotiate an armistice and undermine the Republic. Lacroix-Ries refers to Marc Bloch's review from 1944 of General Chauvinot's 1939 book questioning the possibility of an invasion. Bloch criticized Chauvinot and Pétain for supporting military control over civilian authority and for championing a Fortress France defense strategy that dismantled France's alliances, aligning with German interests. Bloch accused the Marshal not only of flawed military reasoning, but also of engaging in a political maneuver that aided the enemy, labeling it absolute treachery. He argued that it wasn't only figures like Laval or the agitators from February 6, 1934, who were complicit. Without providing proof, Bloch suggested that a widespread act of betrayal deserved to be judged. In 1940, not everyone subscribed to the concept of a fifth column. It was even derided by military correspondent Paul Allard, a Vichy supporter, who attributed the defeat to factors like arithmetic, geography, and strategy. Yet, he noted that the French public's Gallic vanity craved a more fantastical explanation. Influenced by exiles in London, some French individuals believed, according to Allard, that the Cagoule and French fascists had opened the gates for Hitler, ensuring the bridges over the Meuse remained intact. I recall hearing a French person, showing no obvious signs of madness, claim that our defeat was bought with a 10 million franc necklace that Hitler supposedly gave to Madame la Maréchale Pétain. I remember it clearly. This reflects the alarming mindset of a segment of the public, shaped by those who once boasted of educating them, yet left them vulnerable to deceptive narratives that cause us significant harm. Jean Montigny, a pacifist deputy who supported granting Pétain full powers, warned against attributing France's defeat to universal treachery. In his 2 books detailing the political landscape during the defeat, he emphasized the importance of recognizing individual shortcomings. After the war, there were claims that in the 30s, Britain and France conspired to disrupt peace. Allegations of treason and conspiracy, as well as the idea of a 5th column, promised to shed light on the situation, but ultimately provided little evidence. Andrew Shannon pointed out that the 5th column was a flexible idea. It could be used by the right to excuse the army's defeat by blaming it on communist subversion, or by the left to argue that the army and government were infiltrated by anti-democrats. Another issue with the term 5th column was that it blurred the lines between the defeat and the fall of the Republic. Even if a conspiracy existed to undermine the Republic, the available evidence did not explain the events on the battlefield. Lacroix's accusation against Hunziker and Korap, claiming they allowed German forces to breach the defenses, amounted to little more than a claim. Most historians today agree that military defeat was crucial to the downfall of the Third Republic. The parliament members who voted to grant power to Pétain did very little to resist Laval and his supporters. As Shannon and other historians note, the dominant feelings in the summer of 1940 were embarrassment, humiliation, and self-loathing. Philip Nord adds another layer, stating that the Republic didn't simply collapse, it was pushed into destruction. There were figures in this tragedy, many of them officers and civil servants who had little loyalty to the regime they served, along with appeasers and right-wingers who, although a minority, took advantage of a severe crisis to gain temporary power. He highlights the historical significance of the military in France and the enduring tensions between military and civilian authority throughout the Third Republic, tensions that carried over into the Fourth Republic and played a role in forming the Fifth Republic. In assessing the National Assembly's disastrous vote on July 10th, Nord highlights the harmful atmosphere of the time, the Wehrmacht's presence in the nation, the chaos of the exodus, the breakdown of administrative and social order, and, most importantly, the actions of the Republic's adversaries. He concludes that the Republic was betrayed. Pierre Laval orchestrated the vote in the National Assembly, delivering the final blow to a dying Republic. However, it was Pétain, Weygand, Baudouin, and Boutillier who made up the execution squad that unleashed the fatal blow. In this regard, the downfall of the Republic was not due to decadence or a failing parliament, but rather a betrayal, with military leaders and senior civil servants, not politicians, serving as the main offenders. The defeat was, first and foremost, a military one. Pétain subtly suggested as much when he cautioned Reynaud on May 26 not to blame the army. Reynaud took heed and instructed the press to be informed accordingly. In his radio address on June 17th, calling for an end to the fighting, Pétain acknowledged the enemy's superiority in numbers and weaponry. For de Gaulle, broadcasting from London the next day, the defeat stemmed less from numbers and more from the German tanks, aircraft, and tactics that forced a retreat. On June 20th, Pétain likened the defeat to the situation in 1918, when the French had the support of numerous British, Italian, and American divisions, while in 1940, France faced not only a numerical disadvantage against the enemy, but also lacked sufficient armaments, outnumbered in aircraft 6-1. His conclusion was clear: too few friends, too few children, too few arms, too few allies, along with a hint of a recurring theme of decadence, the dominance of the spirit of enjoyment over the spirit of sacrifice. June 25th, the day the armistice took effect and marked national mourning, Pétain emphasized the deep illusion the Allies had in evaluating their true military strength and economic influence. He asserted that freedom of the seas, blockades, and resources were not enough to guarantee victory. The key to victory lies in troops, armaments, and the conditions of their deployment. In this context, Germany held a significant advantage, leaving the Allies with nothing but words of encouragement and hope. Once the northern armies were isolated in Flanders and had to abandon their supplies, the remainder of the French army on the Somme and Aisne could muster only 60 divisions lacking any real fortifications and almost devoid of tanks, facing off against Germany's 150 infantry and 11 armored divisions. Therefore, an armistice became inevitable. In response, on July 2nd, the German High Command issued a statement claiming their ground forces were not numerically superior to those of the four Allies, while acknowledging they had more aircraft. They argued that compared to the combined military strength of France, Britain, Belgium, and the Netherlands, Germany was actually in a weaker position, hindered by fortifications, rivers, and canals. They attributed their victory to deeper factors, like the revolutionary dynamism of the Third Reich and its National Socialist direction, which France mistakenly viewed as a vulnerability. This dynamism had fashioned an unmatched fighting force, melding meticulous preparation with audacity in both planning and execution. Ultimately, this bolstered the esteemed qualities of the German soldier, reflecting the united effort of a people driven by a common vision. According to Barlone, ordinary French citizens struggled to grasp the defeat, holding the entire army accountable rather than just the high command. On June 21st, he noted in his diary a notable shift in civilian behavior toward officers, as respect had diminished. The population, disheartened by defeat, failed to differentiate between those officers who had fought valiantly and the high command, which he believed had not fulfilled its responsibilities. The staff officers in his division were left stunned by the stunning defeat, struggling to comprehend how such a situation had unfolded. It was challenging for everyday French citizens to grasp the defeat. Some accepted Pétain's reasoning, lacking the means to verify the number of divisions and aircraft involved in the conflict. The French media faced strict censorship and had to use vague explanations for the loss. For instance, Jean Percolin, writing under a pseudonym for Le Petit Dauphinois on June 27th, suggested that the defeat stemmed from a departure from natural laws, calling for a fresh perspective to replace the pervasive stench of despair. However, others had sharper insights. According to the Daily Mail, history will likely declare that the Battle of France was irretrievably lost from the moment the Germans first broke the 9th French Army and captured Sedan. Claude Jammet echoed this sentiment, identifying the loss of Sedan as a pivotal moment, if not the most critical turning point. He believed it represented the fundamental dynamics of this astonishing war that partly accounted for the rapidity of our defeat. By May 15th, the outcome was clear. Corrap's army set the precedent, and the others soon followed. The French army from that point onward was characterized by panic, pure and simple. It was a full-speed retreat. In reading the initial accounts of the battle, particularly during the Sedan pocket, which attributed the collapse of our front to the surprise impact on our untrained troops from Hitler's new arm, essentially the tactical use of tanks coordinated with low-flying aircraft, I was instantly reminded of Hannibal's elephants. The difference, however, was that the French never adapted to the situation. Instead, a myth emerged, absurdly perpetuated by unofficial exaggerations in Paris Soir, which was more terrifying than reality itself. Ultimately, the tanks weren't even necessary to breach our lines. Their mere reputation instilled fear. Our regiments fled in certainty. For Charles Rist, Pétain's broadcast, blaming the defeat on a declining birth rate and a love for pleasure, was pitiful. At least Renault had openly acknowledged the military's mistakes. The most dreadful aspect of the defeat was its astonishingly abrupt nature. The swift transition from one day to the next, from total confidence in France's unwavering resistance to the depths of defeat. The reality was almost unbelievable. The consequences of the High Command's grave errors were undeniable. Jacques Benoist Méchain, a temporary prisoner of war, firmly believed that the leaders had betrayed the nation's trust. They either acted knowingly or were completely oblivious. In either case, they were guilty. Everything else was just talk. Journalist Gordon Waterfeld felt that the French people had been poorly guided. Had their leaders sought their support and trust, the people would have fought valiantly to defend their towns and cities, including Paris. They could have sabotaged the German advance to such a degree that significant battles would have emerged, earning worldwide respect and possibly allowing the Allies to regroup, even bringing America into the fight once again. Instead, the French surrendered with their hands tied behind their backs. They were mobilized yet forced to follow orders from an inept general staff and a government obsessed with peace at any cost. Poor leadership left them unarmed. However, given the chance, they could have become their own leaders, something that Pétains and Weygans feared and sought to prevent. They have not lost hope, but now they stand muted beneath the conqueror's heel. Andrew Shannon highlights a paradox. France's defeat was surprising, yet not unimaginable. There had been a clear divide between the pre-war warnings about the state of French society and the unrealistic optimism of Allied propaganda during the Phony War, which claimed victory was assured due to strength. This divide allowed for many interpretations of the defeat. Historian Marc Bloch, in his Deposition by a Defeated Party, distinguished between direct and deeper causes of the defeat. The deeper causes lay within French society, while the immediate cause was the incompetence of the high command. Moreover, Bloch noted the generals were blaming everyone except themselves, pointing fingers at the parliamentary regime, the troops, the British, and even the Fifth Column. Gamelin accused the rank and file of the French army for their reluctance to fight, stating they had no appetite for war. The accusation was included in his final memorandum, written before he was removed from his position as commander-in-chief. The 80,000 Polish troops stationed in France, some of whom fought in the Battle of France, expressed strong dissatisfaction with what they perceived as a lack of fighting spirit among the retreating French armies. However, many others praised the French soldier for his courage, as Barloni noted in his diary on June 14th. Everywhere the enemy advanced, it seemed as if the army could no longer resist. Likely, they lacked the resources to keep fighting, similar to the situation in Belgium. There, the ranks held firm, and the soldiers never recoiled from any sacrifice. Yet they were overwhelmed by the intensity of the enemy's fire and paralyzed by new tactics that caught our staff and the British off guard. Some claimed they weren't prepared for a war like that of 1914 to 1918. Still, officers and men fulfilled their duties whenever they had the capability to fight. The new leaders, Pétain and his military associates, refrained from assigning blame to the rank and file. They also hesitated to criticize the high command. Pétain and his peers were deeply involved in the static defensive strategy that resulted in the military disaster. To deflect scrutiny, they pointed to the failures of the previous government's policies and the inadequacy of preparations. They shifted the blame onto civilian politicians. This accusation resonated even beyond the supporters of the Marshal. By the end of May, it was evident to Friedman that no one in the army was willing to take responsibility or give commands. The nation was perhaps going to die from such cowardice, a problem that had permeated society. The Radical Party, representing the majority, bore the most guilt for their carelessness, negligence, laxity, indiscipline, and selfishness. The country had failed to identify a true statesman to address the crisis, while Daladier, the war minister for 4 years, had imposed Gamelin and retained the vain, hopeless leaders of our high command in their positions. Barlone compared the impeccable organization of the German army with the clearly inadequate setup envisioned by our high command, which failed to account for mobile warfare and focused instead on a static approach. This likely contributed to our defeat. Our frustrating 90-mile advance into Belgium resulted in traffic jams and orders that arrived either several hours late or not at all. We had to make do every step of the way. The government implemented a penny-pinching strategy, denying motorcycles, liaison cars, and trucks to our elite troops to save fuel, fearing they might have to requisition civilian vehicles and upset future voters. This reflects the short-sightedness of the politicians and general officers who have led us to this dire situation. Other critics took this further. Soldier Robert Christophe, who would soon find himself in German captivity for the remainder of the war, believed the French army was too outdated compared to the Germans. He noted that Hitler had been correct in declaring France a nation of the elderly. This suggested a notion of decay as an explanation. Louis Rebatet condemned the entire French army, describing the poor physical specimens, anti-fascist epileptics, and gangrenous Democrats, drafted into service as evidence of the nation's decline. The army became a reflection of France's degeneration. This perceived decadence was destined to become the primary narrative explaining our defeat.